They lined up in a long queue before dawn, when the city was still asleep under a blanket of thick, piercing darkness. Not because it was convenient. No, convenience had long since vanished into oblivion, along with memories of warm beds and full tables. Hunger was easier to bear in the dark. The eyes were not yet accustomed to the light. Thoughts were confused in the labyrinth of half-sleep, and steps seemed slower, as if time itself had slowed down to delay the inevitable. The cold cut into their lungs, cheeks, and fingers. It penetrated their old coats, wrapped in rags instead of scarves, through their woolen shawls, soaked with sweat and snow. People shivered from the cold, clutching cards in their numb hands, thin pieces of paper with numbers instead of names. The names had long since disappeared, as if they had never existed, erased by hunger and despair, like inscriptions on old gravestones. People stood silently, heads bowed, shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. Their breath escaped in icy clouds, mingling with the fog that crept across the pavement. Someone whispered, not words, but simply out of habit, an echo of a former life. No one heard the words, but everyone understood. This was not conversation, but a desperate attempt to hold on to what remained of themselves, remnants of a past when names, hope, and warmth still existed. The cards slid through fingers wet with sweat and melting snow, the numbers almost worn away from constant friction. But someone was still afraid of losing them. To lose a card meant losing the chance for a morsel of food, for a day or two of survival in this world, where humanity had become a luxury. Money ran out in the city before people did. When hunger came, not sudden, like a storm, but slow, like poison seeping into the blood, the market changed currency. Sacks of flour, cans of canned food, bread, that's what ruled now. Those who had nothing left but their own bodies and strength lined up closer to the corner of the square, closer to the piercing wind and the shadows of old, dilapidated houses with boarded-up windows. Those who still had something to offer, skills, belongings, their last reserves, went to another line, where prices were dictated not by coins, but by need. Children were kept closer to the center, not because of pity. Pity had also become rare, but because children left faster, their fragile bodies unable to withstand the cold and hunger, melting like snowflakes in the palm of your hand. She was standing near the end of the line. She was thin, her face worn out from weeks of not eating enough, her hands wrapped in rags instead of gloves, soaked with salt from tears and sweat. She wore shoes of different sizes. The left boot was too small. The right one had a hole in the sole through which snow seeped. Her card was wet from her breath as she tried to warm it, the numbers barely visible under a layer of dirt and smudges. If they wore off completely, she would simply be pushed aside like trash. They wouldn't sell her. They wouldn't let her go. They would forget her, like they forget a broken thing. The auctioneer stood on a makeshift podium, an old crate, and spoke quickly, without emotion, as if reading the weather forecast on a radio that had long since fallen silent. His voice echoed off the walls. 2 days of work, body intact, can speak, doesn't cough. Some nodded, assessing the merchandise with eyes squinted against the wind. Some turned away, unable to look at this fall of humanity. Some looked too closely, with a predatory gleam in their eyes, calculating how much use they could squeeze out of this body. The prices rose quietly, without the excitement of gambling. Hunger does not like noise, just as people do not like pain. The stakes were simple: a piece of bread, a can of stew, a handful of dried fruit. When her number was called, 47, no one raised their hand immediately. Silence hung in the air like a thick fog, oppressive and awkward, saturated with shame and hopelessness. She stood staring at the ground, feeling the cold seeping under her skin, her heart pounding like a drum in the emptiness. He raised his hand, once, confidently. The auctioneer looked at him, then scanned the area, searching for competitors. For food? The man nodded without saying a word. He took a bundle out of his inside pocket. Bread, dry, hard, with a slight coating of mold on the crust. But still, real bread, capable of satisfying hunger for at least a day. No one outbid him, not because they couldn't. There were those in the crowd who had better crumbs to offer. It was because they knew that to argue would be to admit that you were just like everyone else, ready to trade people for survival. The auctioneer waved his hand indifferently. "Take it." The man approached slowly, calmly, without haste, as if it were not an auction, but a meeting of old acquaintances. He untied the rope around her wrists, a rough rope that had rubbed her skin raw. She waited for an order, a word, a gesture, a habit ingrained in her bones after months of humiliation. He said nothing. He just put the bread in her trembling hands, nodded slightly, and turned away, disappearing into the fog. The crowd parted before him like water before a stone. She remained standing in place, clutching the bundle so tightly that the crust dug into her palms. The people around her watched, some with envy, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. Some expected her to run after him like an obedient dog. Others expected her to be sent back to the line, the transaction declared invalid. She looked at the bread, then at the man's receding back, his silhouette dissolving into the gray dawn. And she walked in the opposite direction. The city did not notice this immediately. Her steps on the pavement felt heavy, each one echoing in her knees and shoulders, weakened by hunger. Gray smoke rose from the factory chimneys, mixing with the fog and the smell of burning. The streets were empty and cold, the ice crunching underfoot. She held the bread tightly, almost like a talisman. Inside a strange lump grew. Not fear, not hope, but something between them. The houses were boarded up, and muffled cries of despair sometimes came from behind the walls. She walked around them, listening for sounds, footsteps in the attics, branches against the walls, the clang of metal in the distance. The world seemed like a translucent dream. For the first time in a long time, she felt a little free. Not completely, but at least she had a choice. To walk without a leash, without a number on a card, without someone else's voice. Memories flooded back. Childhood, the smell of bread on Sundays, her parents who disappeared in one of the queues. She sat down on the icy curb by the ruins of a fountain and placed the bread next to her. She looked at the city, trying to figure out where to hide, where to wait. In the evening, she found an abandoned warehouse behind some rusty railroad tracks. The door creaked, and inside there was gray concrete, dust, and the smell of dampness. She sat down in a corner, hugging her knees. The darkness was thick but familiar, not painful to the eyes. For the first time she could think without fear. She remembered the man, how quietly he approached, how calmly he gave her bread, asking for nothing in return. This act was stronger than any threats from the past. Why him? Pity? Or just another person in this world of wolves? The night passed slowly. Stars were visible through the cracks in the roof. The wind chilled her shoulders, but she did not shiver as she had in the square. In the morning she went to the river. The water was icy and murky, but she washed her hands, face, and clothes. A small ritual of erasing the past. Each step was cautious but determined. Soon she noticed footprints in the snow, male, neat, parallel to her path. She was not surprised. He was nearby, not because he was ordered to be, but because it was important. They walked together, but at a distance at first. They were silent. Sometimes he would offer her food, an apple found in an abandoned orchard, or a piece of cheese from his supplies. Sometimes he simply pointed the way, a nod of his head toward a safe path. They moved quietly, avoiding crowded streets, old buildings with looters, empty courtyards where gangs might be hiding. She listened to his breathing, his footsteps, the crunch of snow under his boots. It became her guide in the chaos. Once, they stumbled upon a group of travelers, 3 men and a woman, their faces scarred from fights over food. They surrounded them, demanding tax, a share of what they had. The man stood in front without drawing his weapon, but his posture spoke louder than words. "Don't come any closer." She clenched her fists, ready to run or fight. The travelers backed away, muttering curses. Apparently, they saw something in the man's eyes that scared them away, like shadows from a fire. They found a small, half-abandoned hut on a hill behind a strip of forest. One corner of the house had tilted over time, and the roof leaked, letting in raindrops, but it was enough to shelter them from the wind and prying eyes. She crossed the threshold and looked around the place for the first time. Dust on the shelves, cobwebs in the corners, an old table with a leg propped up by a stone. He said nothing, just lit a fire in the rusty stove, laid out a blanket and a clean cloth for bandaging wounds. She sat down on the floor, hugging her knees. He looked at her. He didn't demand anything, didn't ask any questions. He just watched, giving her space. Several days passed. They gathered firewood from the nearby forest, checked the well for clean water, and repaired the roof with straw and found boards. She learned to notice details, where a board was cracked, where water had frozen in the cracks, where she could set a trap for small game, rabbits or birds. He taught her silently, putting a tool in her hand, showing her the movement once, without repetition. Then he would go into the forest, watching from the shadows, letting her try for herself. She became stronger, more cautious, more attentive. For the first time in a long time, no one was telling her how to live. She was making her own choices step by step. But at night, the memories came back. The auctions where she was sold for a bowl of soup. The nights in chains when her body ached from beatings. She would wake up in a sweat, and he, without saying a word, would put wood on the fire so that the light would drive away the shadows. Once she found a small book left in the corner of the hut by the previous inhabitants. The leather cover was cracked, the pages blank, yellowed with age. He did not tell her to write. did not tell her to keep it. She opened it, ran her fingers over the white pages, feeling the smoothness of the paper. For the first time, she could call herself by name. She wrote slowly with a trembling hand, Anya, the name she had chosen herself in honor of her mother and lost to starvation. The days passed one after another, merging into a rhythm of survival. They were building something that was more than just a shelter. They were making the world around them a little cleaner, a little safer, without words, without orders. Every movement was important. She cleaned the well, he reinforced the door. Every action was a sign that trust was growing, like the roots of a tree in the soil. One day, a man approached the hut. He was different, with a fake smile, shiny boots, hands too clean for this world. He spoke smoothly, offering a better life in the city, where there was supposedly work and food. But his eyes gave him away. He was a recruiter, one of those who lured people into new auctions. She did not flinch, standing behind the man. He just stood there, silent, showing that he was protecting her. The man left, spitting in the snow, muttering threats. They were silent for a long time after that, but in the silence, an understanding was born. They were not alone against the world, but together. Winter came quickly, like a knife blow. Snow covered the ground in a thick layer, making everything quiet and muffled. They sat by the stove, silent. The darkness was not scary. The wind did not pierce their bones. The fire drove away the cold. They breathed together, did small things. She cooked meals from their stored supplies. He repaired something broken. No one crossed boundaries, but their closeness grew. They learned to live side by side without needing words. Little by little, she stopped being afraid of shadows, and he stopped expecting an attack from around the corner. They didn't call it home, but it was home. Their first real home in years. Finally, she picked up the book again. She wrote, "Freedom is not leaving, but choosing to stay." She left it on the shelf next to the small metal box where they kept their tools. He watched, asking no questions. She understood. Now their world was their world, built on trust. The snow melted slowly, reluctantly, leaving behind black patches of earth and thin rivulets that rang over stones like the first hesitant notes. Spring arrived not boldly but cautiously, carrying the scent of wet bark, thawing pine needles, and that particular dampness that makes everything inside tremble and come alive. They moved in the same rhythm, as if they had long been dancing this wordless dance. She took out old rags, washed the windows, scraped away the grime of winter until the light entered the cabin cleaner and sharper. At the same time, he stood on the roof, hammering, replacing rotten boards, checking every nail, as though he wanted to make sure nothing would ever drip on them again. During the day, she put up shelves from rough planks he had planned himself. He carried armfuls of firewood, stacking them neatly against the wall, each log fitted to the next, like words in a good sentence. They still spoke little, but every movement became a conversation. She reaches for the bucket. He is already bringing it. He lingers at the threshold, wiping his boots. She silently opens the door a little wider. These small gestures replaced long explanations. In the mornings, she sat on the porch with a clay mug of hot herbal tea made from fireweed and dried mint. She watched the sun rise slowly above the jagged wall of forest, first tinting the pine tops pink, then gold. The air was still cold, but already alive. He came out afterward and sat beside her on the step, not too close, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of his shoulder. They were silent. That morning the silence was not empty, but warm, enveloping, like an old blanket. For the first time in a long while, she sat without waiting for something bad to happen. She simply sat, breathed, and that was enough. Summer arrived with the dust of roads, hot wind, and the thick smell of warmed wood. She made a garden behind the cabin, small beds, worked by hand, and an old hoe. Seed potatoes, dill, parsley, a few bushes of mint and chamomile. She talked to the plants, quietly, almost in a whisper, as if they were living beings. He built a fence of poles and wire so deer and rabbits wouldn't eat everything overnight. In the evenings, they lit a small fire behind the house. They sat on a log, watched sparks fly into the dark sky, listened to dry branches crackle. Sometimes she rested her head on his shoulder, just for a moment. But it was enough. One day they went down to the nearest village to the old well. A woman in a headscarf, drawing water, looked at her closely and asked, "What's your name, girl?" She didn't flinch. She looked straight into the eyes and answered calmly, evenly, "Just Anya." Because now she could. Because this name could no longer be taken away. Freedom didn't burst into their life with fanfare. It didn't shout, didn't demand applause. It came quietly, like dawn, like the first real breath after a long nightmare. And it stayed, not as a guest, as the mistress of the house, because Anya had chosen it herself, and so had he. Another full year passed, round, thawed, and frozen again. Autumn came early, first with gold and crimson leaves, then with cold nights when breath became visible and the stars seemed closer. The garden gave everything it could, not abundantly, but honestly. Baskets of potatoes, bunches of dried dill, a few pumpkins they sliced and dried in the attic. They gathered mushrooms, boletus, porcini, chanterelles, and salted them in an old tub. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung under the ceiling, the house filled with the scent of summer that would warm them through the winter. The cabin had grown noticeably sturdier over the year. He completely re-roofed it, new boards, a layer of birch bark, then heavy earth and grass on top. The walls he reinforced with logs and clay mixed with straw. The biggest change was a small window with real glass. He had carried it from an abandoned house in the valley, 3 hours each way. The glass was cracked in one corner, but it still let in light cleaner and brighter than before. Now in the mornings, a true square of sunlight lay on the floor, and Anya sometimes stood in it barefoot, feeling the warmth on her soles. Rumors of great changes kept arriving, like ripples on water. They said that in the big cities, auctions had finally been banned, that people were gathering into communities, sharing bread, potatoes, firewood equally, that young people went around asking the old for their real names. Sometimes travelers came to them, weary with worn rucksacks and eyes still carrying the road. One of them asked at the gate, "Is it true that free people live here?" Anya poured him a bowl of hot mushroom and herb soup. Max brought an armful of dry spruce branches for bedding. They gave him shelter in the entryway, but didn't invite him further inside. Not out of fear, their freedom was simply different, small, personal. built not on slogans, but on the trust of two people who had learned not to hurt each other. One deep night, Anya woke to the crack of branches beyond the fence. Her heart raced, but not from terror, from readiness. She rose silently, took the knife that always lay under her pillow. Max was already on his feet, axe in one hand, lantern in the other. They stepped out together, shoulder to shoulder. In the darkness, right by the gate, stood a boy of about 12, thin, almost transparent, eyes huge and shining with tears and fear. "My name is Tim," he whispered in a trembling voice. "They sold me. I ran away. I've been running for 3 days." Anya looked at Max. He gave a silent nod. They brought the boy inside, sat him by the stove. Anya warmed the leftovers of supper, poured him herbal tea. Tim ate greedily, but tried not to slurp. Someone, sometime, had taught him manners. Then he fell asleep, right on the floor, curled under an old sheepskin coat. In the morning, Anya gave him her old jacket. It was too big for him, but warm. Tim asked, looking from her to Max, "Do you have names?" "Anya," she answered calmly. The boy turned to the man. Anya also looked at him. For the first time in all this time, asking the question aloud. "And you?" He was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Then, very quietly, almost inaudibly, he said, "Max." Tim stayed with them until spring. Not forever. They agreed on that from the start. In winter he helped split firewood, carry water, learned to weave willow baskets. Anya taught him to read from an old yellowed book she found in the attic. When the snow melted and the roads became passable, he prepared to go farther, toward the people he had heard about. Anya gave him a sack of food, rusks, dried meat. Max drew a simple but accurate hand-drawn map. Before leaving, Tim placed on the shelf beside the book a small wooden knife he had carved himself, a bit crooked but carefully made. On the handle he had scratched the letter T. Anya and Max were alone again. The garden turned green once more. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, like an arrow pointing upward. They began to speak a little more, briefly, about the weather, which seeds sprout best, that the gate needed fixing tomorrow. Sometimes they were silent for hours, but this silence was different now. Not heavy, not oppressive, but warm, like the breathing of someone sleeping beside you. They weren't saving the world. They didn't march into squares with banners. They didn't write manifestos. They simply saved each other, day after day, after gesture, after silence. And it turned out that was quite enough. Freedom grew slowly, like a tree from a tiny seed, unnoticed by outsiders, but sinking its roots deeper into the earth with every year. And they stayed, because they chose to, because they could, because they wanted to.